This is AP Lit, and today is Monday, January 11th, and I'm giving this sort of review or summary of our discussion today of chapters 12 through 18 in the AP Lit class. We had a quiz, which I'll post for anybody that's out, but I just wanted to highlight some of the issues that we brought up in our discussion. One of the issues is how Huck is not sentimental in these chapters. We pointed out 2 or 3 occasions where he was not sentimental. The first occasion was when he made the decision to save himself and Jim, and basically doomed the 3 robbers on board the Walter Scott to death. And he did make an effort to try to give them help, but it never worked out. So rather than worrying about it, he makes a couple of comments about it. One is saying it was no time for sentimenting, and that's the beginning of chapter, I believe it was 16. But he said there's no sentimenting, no time for that. So he's very practical. Instead of getting sentimental about saving himself and Jim, as opposed to the robbers, he just made a quick decision and did it. Later, after he realized that they probably had already died, he said that he could live with that if they could. So it's just a very practical response. He made an effort, and he doesn't beat himself up over it or remember it very long. And finally, the last example was when Buck died. It says he cried a little after Buck died, and that's the last time you hear Buck's name in the book. So it's just 3 examples of how Huck is very practical, even when it comes to death, and makes quick decisions and learns to live with them. Another issue is that you really do have to understand is when Huck makes a decision not to turn Jim in, it's not because he thinks he's doing a good thing as concerning slavery. Throughout the entire book, Huck never says that slavery is bad. In fact, he thinks he's bad when he helps a slave, Jim, become free. And that's interesting from our point of view, and I think from anybody's point of view, you would think, of course slavery is bad. But for these people in the book who grow up in it, and particularly uneducated like Huck is, he's not aware that it's bad. And he makes an interesting comment after he decides not to turn Jim in, because Jim is so nice to him and is complimenting him and everything. He just couldn't do it. So one of the things he says to himself, if he had turned him in, which is the right thing, he would have felt bad. If he didn't turn him in, which is the wrong thing in his opinion, he would feel bad. So he said if he's going to feel the same either way, he will just decide to do the easiest thing. And it was the easiest thing, because he liked Jim, was not to turn him in. It's interesting logic. It shows you that he doesn't understand the issue, and he never does throughout the whole book. Another theme in the book is the theme of the feud between the Grangerfords and Shepherdsons. They don't know why they're fighting, and they've fought for generations. And somebody in the class made the point that the feud is a lot like the Civil War, which is the granddaddy of all feuds, a feud within the family we call America. And most people, I don't know, it's hard to say if most people knew what they were fighting for or didn't, but the fact is that most people who fought probably didn't have a clear understanding of why they were fighting. They were just fighting because they were drafted or they enlisted for other reasons. Huck and Buck are like alter egos to each other. Huck and Buck are the names rhyme. They're about the same age. Buck is what somebody pointed out is what Huck would have been if he had grown up with a family. And somebody also pointed out, here's a guy with a family, which Huck wants so badly to have, but in this case, this is not a very good family. They're good to each other, but they're terrible to other people. And so, also Buck has a slave, and he gives Huck a slave to be his slave as long as he's there. And Huck says he doesn't have a lot of work for his slave to do because he's not used to having one. Buck, however, keeps his slave busy, and I think it shows how corrupting slavery was for the slave owners. It ruins their character because they rely on another human being to do things they ought to do for themselves, and of course at the expense of that other person's freedom. Another issue is his relationship to Jim, and we can trace kind of a progression here. At the beginning of the story, Huck and Tom play a trick on Jim, and he doesn't feel bad about it at all. That is, Huck doesn't. Then Huck plays a trick on Jim on Jackson's Island by putting the snakeskin in Jim's bedroll, and of course the mate comes and bites Jim, and he feels terrible. Unlike the first time, this time Huck feels terrible, but not terrible enough to admit that he did it. And then the third time we see this happen is in the fog incident, when Jim and Huck are separated by the fog, and when Huck finally catches up with Jim, he tells Jim that Jim was just lying, that Huck had been on the raft the entire time and never was off it. And so Jim starts to think he dreamed it and starts making an elaborate explanation for what the dream meant. And then finally it occurs to him that Huck is playing a joke on him. And at that point, Jim tells Huck, he calls him boss. He had been calling him things like honey and really terms of endearment, but he realizes that this was a trick, and he didn't like it. He tells Huck, he says, I was really worried about you. I cared about you enough to be worried and prayed for you, and you think it's a big joke. To show Huck's growth as a person, not only does he feel bad about it, but this time he feels bad about it and does something about it. He goes to Jim and confesses and asks for an apology, gives him an apology. One interesting thing in the book, you'll notice that Huck, whenever Jim outsmarts him, Huck resorts to his kind of innate racism. It's not innate maybe, but his learned racism, that he uses the N-word, and he said, well, you can't teach him anything because he's a part of this group. That just shows you that kind of unconscious or subconscious racism that Huck has in the book. These were just some of the issues that we came across. We'll spend some more time on Wednesday talking about Emmeline Grangerford and her sentimentalism. And it should be noted that sentimentalism or sentimentality is always false by this definition, that it's exaggerated, extreme, and usually insincere emotions, as opposed to real sentiments and emotions. And Emmeline Grangerford is the perfect example of a sentimentalist. And Mark Twain uses her artwork and her poem to show how sentimental it is, because he makes fun of it. He pokes fun at it and shows how silly it is. So these were just some of our discussion today about Huck. We pointed out the Romeo and Juliet connection with the feud. So keep reading the book. We'll read 17 through 19 for Thursday, and maybe this brief video will help you appreciate what's happened in chapters 13 through 18. Thank you.